Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today, this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. Before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional people of the land of where I am. So I'm in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and to their leaders, past, emerging and present. So I'm Simone Dossetor. I'm the CEO of Insurtech Australia. We're a member-based not-for-profit association, and we've got 90 Insurtech members and 45 corporate partners, and we're really all about building a world-leading ecosystem to connect, facilitate and promote innovation in the insurance industry. Today, we're really delighted to be partnering with FDATA and with FinTech Australia to host this satellite event as part of the CDR Month. FDATA is a not-for-profit global association supporting financial services companies operating the open banking and open finance sector. And they came to us with the idea about this month of really how can they help build awareness around what the CDR is, how can we showcase opportunities and use cases, and how we can educate really around this sort of cross-sector opportunity. And so we were really keen to run this session, to bring together some experts that have been working on this already and thinking about it, and to build some of the learnings from the banking and other sectors as well. And so really today will be all about a discussion on those topics. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we'll either manage those as we go through or we'll cover them at the end. So that was really all I wanted to say as an introduction, and I'll hand you over to our panel moderator today, is Mytka, who's the Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand of FDATA, and then I'll let him introduce and ask the questions to our panelists.
Thank you, Simone. Welcome everyone that is listening and that will be listening to this. What I'll do is just to support with some of the framing for our discussion with these wonderful panelists that we have here today is just to talk a little bit about the CDR, or the consumer data right. We use these acronyms and not everyone understands what they always mean. Ironically, we called it CDR Month, and that to try and boost awareness around the consumer data right, and there's some irony in that. So the consumer data right is this reform that's started out in a seed concept many years ago with the Productivity Commission's report into data availability and use back in 2016 to 2017. And that was looking at how can we open up access to data to enable more innovation within the economy and more competition. And the part of the inspiration for that followed on was what the UK did with open banking to create some standards, and that was essentially a competition and economic reform. It is many things. So it's an economic reform where consumers have the ability to, with their consent, direct a company, let's say an Insurtech, to be able to access banking data or energy data, in this case that we've got live now, so that company can provide a proposition to that consumer. So privacy and security is a big consideration with the consumer data right, and some of the, I guess, the spirit of this reform is to enable consumers to have more meaningful control over their data, but also to catalyze industry innovation and competition. And we've seen it evolve over the past several years with the legislation, the standards and guidelines from a technical data and CX perspective. And we now have banking data live and energy data live. And the recent decisions from the Australian government and the priorities that they outlined in the recent budget indicated a pause on any sectoral expansion. So essentially a whole of sector being designated or mandated in this sense from a compliance perspective with these regulations to open up and create standards and APIs to make the data that they have on their consumers, their customers, available to other companies and to the consumer to be able to share it. And now we've got a focus just on banking and energy and non-bank lending as another sector that's designated, as well as what's called payment initiation and action initiation. So now what we have is a pause on any further expansion into superannuation or insurance in this case. And I guess the question now is, do we need that prescribed mandate for industry to really lead the innovation? What are the type of roles that industry can more proactively play in driving the innovation agenda under the consumer data right reforms? And the government, given that there's some really solid foundations that have already been laid, facilitate that innovation within industries like banking and further financial services and areas like insurance. Given that framing, I'll probably direct this question at you, Anthony, on how can industry play a more leading role in driving that innovation agenda, given that it's kind of doing it already in many ways. Data-enabled innovation is not anything new. What are the things that you've been doing, given you've done a lot of work in this area, helping companies specifically with CDR, but also just in innovation? What can companies do to kind of lead rather than just lobby?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Look, I think there's two or three things I would say. One is familiar.
I think you might have frozen.
Did we just have a dropout right as Anthony was about to deliver some insightful commentary?
It looks like
the mic drop moment.
It does look like that. Thank you, internet infrastructure. Okay, well, it's probably a continuation of that question that we can follow up on. And Jason, I mean, you've got a whole bunch of international experience here in the work that you do. What are what are the things that we can do now to start continuing to just push on with innovation that actually provides a little bit of a lead for the government to learn from and work with industry to figure this stuff out and be a little bit more proactive?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I've got a slightly pessimistic view of industry stepping up, because I'm not sure, if I'm really honest, I'm not sure that the incentives are necessarily in place. And I think, why, if you look at, Australia's got a really interesting history, government stepping in to increase competition and reduce switching for telcos. I think we led the world on that. The ability to port your number, because the perception of like having to switch from one telco to the other and using your number was an incredible barrier for consumer switching. I think it was Australia that led the world in that space. And we saw similar things in banking, actually. Before we talked about open banking, there was just the banking switching service. We saw that in the UK as well. So I think ultimately a lot of the benefits to the customer, if we're really specifically talking about open insurance, might be keen to kind of talk about it a bit more, the customer benefits, but a lot of it will come down to, you talked about it earlier, come down to increasing competition. And are the incentives actually in place for the big kind of dominant market players? Are they really going to pile in with new infrastructure and new ways of working to ultimately increase competition? I'm not saying that they're going to not want to, but is the incentive there for them to lead? And I think if we look at other sectors, it did take a bit of a regulatory shift, or a big one in some cases, to get the telco sector to solve the problem for consumer switching, or to get the banking sector to solve those problems. So I don't know. I don't want to come across as jaded, but I'm just not sure that the incentives are going to be strong enough for industry to solve this in isolation from any reg change.
That is absolutely a warranted perspective to have, Jason. Given the past behaviour and what we've seen previously, and a good example, I guess, is the telcos. Even now here in Australia, with those things in place to enable number porting, the telcos still make it a little bit challenging to put barriers in consumers' way to move over to another provider. So yeah, you do need those incentives, and I think the push force of regulations play a significant role in moving these things forward. Anthony, before your mic dropped, we had this question. You probably got a perspective that might build on what Jason was just kind of talking about.
Sorry about that. I'm back on again. So look, I would agree with Jason. I think the incentive for the big guys to pile in and be part of a switching, making switching easier is pretty low. So I think it's going to take some regulatory push. That's what happened in banking. So I think in telco, I think it's going to happen across the sectors. So we should expect that pattern to repeat. I think for the more forward-thinking people out there, though, there's a bit more to this than switching, right? So, the ability for insurers to use open data for risk selection and pricing, for loyalty, for streamlining their onboarding exists today. So insurers could become accredited data recipients right now, well before their obligations as data holders kick in 2 or 3 years' time. And, I would like to see some of the players in the market actually innovating and using the data they could get their hands on today to improve customer experience. I strongly believe that getting consumer utility will have to lead this. So there has to be something in it for the consumer. So there's got to be an easier onboarding process or better pricing or something that's going to make consumers want to use it, that's going to make the difference. And the forward-thinking insurers out there who can find some of those use cases which resonate I think will win.
Yeah, that's a good point. That the use cases, the ones that are, I guess, desirable to consumers, that provide convenience, save them money, reduce friction in onboarding, they're the things that matter. But also thinking through what's viable for the business, what's the business case for this is an important aspect, and what's feasible given the current technology and all the standards around this, but also what's socially preferable. What are the ways in which we use data that align to the things that matter, particularly around privacy and security. So that responsible innovation piece. Nick, given Suncorp's played a role a bit, they were a data holder designated under banking. What are some of the insights from the banking sector that can be brought into this that insurers need to know? Yeah, given there's an opportunity to be an ADR now as an insurer, you don't necessarily have to wait to be mandated as a data holder, but what have we learned from banking that can support the discussion here?
Thanks for the question, Matt. So as a bank, we were mandated, and the banking sector as a whole. And so as an industry, we went through the process of getting accredited, and it was a significant build on all the bank's part. Essentially, what we have now done is built the foundation to be able to share that data. It is still early days. It's been about a year since this has gone live across the industry, across most of the players now. And so customer take-up is still evolving. And as you called out earlier, there has to be a really compelling use case, because this is a consent-based customer data sharing arrangement. And unless there is a compelling use case for customers, they won't feel the need to share the data. And the other thing that is happening right now, as you're aware, there's a lot of uncertainty and question marks around sharing data because of scams and fraud and so on. So that also comes into the customer mindset about, should they share this information with someone else? So until there is a really compelling proposition in front of customers, there will need to think about whether they would. Some of the most compelling use cases right now in banking are things like when you apply for a home loan, making it really simple to aggregate income and expense verification. That is a real use case. Customers want to get a loan rather than in the old days pulling out lots of sheets of paper and saying, here's what I spent on this, that, and trying to aggregate it. Just getting that simplified works, and the industry is moving towards that. And then increasingly with action initiation, there'll be players that find compelling use cases that give customers switching opportunities. And when that is in front of customers, I think customers will think about sharing their data.
Yeah, the propositions to the consumer need to be reasonably compelling, particularly when factoring in people's anxieties around sharing data in the current environment. We've been well exposed to the discussions and the public discussions and the trends around data sharing. You know, we've had the Snowden effect, if we can call it that, around, you know, large scale surveillance and collusion maybe between government and, you know, or the 17 eyes and 5 eyes and however many eyes we have these days with large tech companies, but also, you know, Cambridge Analytica and data breaches. So in the consumer's mind, there's a lot of considerations when they're asked to share their data with maybe, you know, a new fintech that, you know, or some startup that they might not necessarily have a lot of information or understand. So that the elements of what's important for trust, you know, and trust in the data practices of that organization are important. And Fabrizia, some of the emerging trends that we're kind of seeing around open insurance, there's kind of use cases and things that are already taking place that give us a bit of an insight over what we can really do if we start leveraging data in meaningful ways to support consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. You know. And thanks, Matt. I hope the segue wasn't, here is a startup that doesn't have trust from their customers. Jokes aside, we are a pretty early stage startup, but from a Koverd point of view, everything we do is with the view of what we'll be able with CDR or with the principles of CDR. So we spend a lot of time thinking about those use cases, and I'm gonna be the optimist in this conversation, I think. Because I very much look at it from the consumer point of view, and I think there are lots of benefits that can come from a customer point of view throughout the value chain. So, you know, we talked about the switching, which is obviously what makes the incumbents feel uncomfortable about this whole thing. But there will be benefits also in understanding policies, understanding what the contract of insurance really covers you for. Setting expectations. So I think, you know, preventing more and more consumers from ending up in a point where they want to put through a claim and they think they're covered, and then all of a sudden they find out they aren't. I think from the claims point of view as well, you know, think of all the data that gets passed along as you have an accident or something happens. You need to go to your insurer. There's sometimes a third party. There's then a service provider. So how can we unlock that data to really make that process more seamless? All the way to, you know, insurance. And I come from having worked in insurance for a little while. I think in insurance, we think insurance is it. We are the entire world for somebody. Well, we're not. So even when we look at the financial needs of an individual, they go to a financial planner. So how do we allow them to show their insurance position through utilizing the data that exists about them? So I think there are plenty of use cases. I agree with Jason that the incentive is probably not quite as strong for the incumbents to jump on. And the reality is there is a big structural job to be done. You know, as Nick was mentioning, from a banking point of view, it's a huge undertaking. Already today, you know, things like the claims database for car and home, the IRS, it's in place. It's not clean. It's not well used. it could do the job of in a very small capacity, but it's not maintained properly. So it is a big undertaking. I said I was going to be positive, sorry.
It's definitely helpful for the discussion. And I guess we take for granted just coordinating human action to figure this stuff out, how challenging it always is. I think, at smaller scales, kind of, deciding on dinner with my family is sometimes presents a challenge, let alone, getting public and private sector stakeholders all on board to, improve the way databases and data structures work and access to them. And it's a huge, it's a huge complex challenge. And CDR, I guess, is emblematic of that, given the scope that we have across sectors and economy wide. That in and of itself, I guess, brings, how do we break down? Like, how do we coordinate better? Because there is so much brains trust, there's so much innovation that's already taking place, but it's not necessarily being harnessed in a way to move these markets. Yes, we need, I think, absolutely incentives. The push needs to be there. If the incumbents don't have a mandate, they're not going to move. Even non-compliance with a mandate is sometimes just seen as a cost of doing business, because they have the capital to be able to deal with a many $1 million fine, and it kind of not really hit their operations too much. So what can we do? What are industry associations like Insurtech Australia do? Lots of fantastic work in convening our bodies, but what else can we do to really help move the needle? Because it seems like a little silly to wait for the government to prescribe this when there's probably some great innovation work that can already be done that kind of shows a pathway forward. That's open to anyone. So
I think we've all talked about the importance of clear benefits to consumers, and I think what do we see is about, what, in Australia, 11 million households, give or take, something like that, and you go, every one of those households needs some home insurance, and you go, for a customer basically switching their home insurance, incredibly painful experience, incredibly painful. You need to remember, you're sitting there filling out your quote to try and shop around. You've got to think about, actually, what's all the information to do with my house? I know some of it gets pre-filled and there's some clever data things you can do in the background, but you've still got to ultimately think, is that right? Was my house really built in 1902 or was it 1982? You've got to remember all of your previous claims, which you may or may not had, but you probably had some. You've got to remember often the value and when were they within the last 3 years, the last 5 years. That's a bit of arithmetic. And then worst of all, you've got to remember anything valuable that's over about $2,000. Most Australian home contents policies, anything over $2,000 is classed as a valuable, and you've got to list it on your insurance. That's probably a MacBook. Anything more valuable than a MacBook, maybe an engagement ring, whatever it might be. You've got to remember all of those things. That's information that your current insurer already has at their fingertips, right? And you're trying to switch and kind of like do the right thing by your household and by your family. Your current insurer is sitting on all of that data and you have no access to it. And I think we need to, if we really want to cut through here, I think we need to zoom in on some of the most kind of powerful and compelling consumer stories, and zoom in on those stories and think about how we can, how do we shine light on those as an Insurtech community, or a community that can influence reg, or a community that can influence different stakeholders? Because I think Australia is pretty uniquely positioned to other markets. You go, it's not as competitive as other markets, no matter how you want to sort of look at it. It's definitely not as competitive. And actually, IRS is, I think it's very small and questionable how, the value that's going to continue to add. There isn't really an existing solution for data sharing. There actually isn't. And I think the fact that there is this absence and these really strong consumer stories, I think there's a role for us to play to kind of help package that up so that government and others can actually see the opportunity, but it's got to be made really clear and really visceral for them, because otherwise it quickly becomes technical and too hard for them to engage with.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jason. I think making it tangible for decision makers to see, well, wow, this can actually provide an extraordinary benefit, and, relieving the pain, the pains and creating gains for consumers, in these processes that are extremely onerous, and it's a headache, like having to figure out, every time, and this is the interesting part, comparing, insurance to banking. Like, I interact with my bank daily, it's my money. I've got a very different relationship with that brand as a consumer versus my insurer. It's only these specific life events or, at renewal that I'm interacting with them, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. It's important in my life as a consumer. And I don't want to have to go through the pain of dealing with, gathering all this information. So because I know that I can get a better deal and I've got to go through that whole process again. If we can come together and really kind of make that tangible to decision makers, there's no reason why we can't fast track smaller scale pilots to demonstrate, well, look, there's a reason why we should be moving fast on this sector or these use cases, because this matters to people. It matters to our economy. It matters to jobs. It matters to, giving people their time back. It's our most finite resource. No one wants to spend it, finding documents and, categorizing all their, home assets that are over $2,000 to kind of provide to a new insurer. So what can we do? I think designating the whole of sectors is also such a big bang approach that has extraordinary costs. And I guess, Nicholas, you can probably attest to that, the amount of money that Suncorp's probably had to spend just getting this stuff stood up. And I think the treasurer at an event last week talked about the several hundreds of millions of dollars that the government spent. Compare that to industry that spent billions of dollars in standing up the infrastructure for open banking, with no real validation on the business case and the return on investment. So it's just kind of seen as a cost and this kind of compliance mandate. And given what you were just talking about, Jason, I think if we focus on the journeys that matter to a consumer, and an example that I like to think about is, if I was looking at the life journey of searching for, moving into a new home, or getting a mortgage for and moving into a new home, there's a whole bunch of friction that's involved across lots of consumer to business relationships that are important there. Fabrizia, you've probably got some important and insightful input here. So I'll kind of circle back on this life journey approach in a moment.
Yeah, look, it sounds like you should give Koverd a go. But apart from that, now it's absolutely true. So there's my view, and it's a little bit flippant, but lots, if not most, of the problems that insurance has as an industry today are down to data not being used to its full potential and to the benefit of the consumer. I mean, you talk to anybody in insurance and they'll say, we have lots of data, it's amazing data, and I don't dispute that at all, but it's not being used to actually help the consumer. And to some extent, other businesses, like you mentioned, mortgage brokers, they are helping you navigate a complex process of your mortgage. You're already not having fun when you do that, but you do it, you go through it, you're sharing a lot of data. That is absolutely the same, largely, data that is needed to provide insurance. So how do we leverage that? And We're already kind of playing in that space, and of course others are. That's one of the ways we can start to do things before CDR is in place. But if I can, for one second, go back to your previous question of what can we do, and we were talking about how expensive this is and the funds that are required. There's lots of government grants for initiatives that are of importance to the Australian society and community. If you were to apply a startup mentality to the issue here, you have a government that wants to figure out how to apply CDR to insurance. Well, get a few startups to run various MVPs of that. So what is the use case, as we're all talking about? What are various use cases? How would you do it if CDR was in place, and then reverse engineer it? How do you get there? So yeah, we need money as for startups.
That's a fantastic point, Fabrizia. And yeah, again, it comes back to the incentives. I think there's the push and pull incentives that need to be there to kind of move and shift behavior. If a startup, bootstrapping or kind of venture funded, there's always constraints on your cash. You need to know that this bet that you're making has a higher probability of paying off. And if there's incentives through tax offsets or specific grants, I think this is something that needs to be elevated in the discussion with CDR much more. The government in the response to the statutory review made reference to incentives like the open up challenge that was run in the UK, for instance, around open banking, where there was a few £1 million that were offered to startups early on. Those types of things really need to be looked at, because there's entrepreneurs that are out there that have the skills, the competencies to really kind of show a pathway forward on, like you said, here's a bunch of pilots that demonstrate we can actually do this. Work with the regulators, work with the policymakers, and the standard setters to actually fast track this. There's no reason. The only reason, I guess, what are the reasons why we can't do this? What's actually holding us back from actually pushing forward this innovation agenda? Anthony, you've probably got some key insights around that particular question.
Well, there's a couple of things I would add. So one, I think this piece around life events and removing friction is critical. So I spent 3 years in the mortgage broking industry, and we were trying to solve the problem of friction in the mortgage broking and mortgage switching process. And I still strongly believe that long term, the ability to effectively day trade your home loan or day trade your insurance policies is where we're going to end up. So when we get to a real frictionless data economy, and all the data about me and what I need to take out an insurance policy or get a home loan is freely available and can be matched with the person that wants to take that risk on, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to switch products day in, day out and effectively remove all the dead weight. Now that gets really exciting for consumers, because they save an awful lot of money and an awful lot of hassle over the long run. It's not very exciting for the people trying to make a profit out of it, because they'll have to find different ways of solving for making a profit, which they will. But actually it becomes a fairer and much less frictionful market. So that first of all, I'd say that gets exciting. The second thing I think worth throwing into the conversation is digital identity. So, that's the other big disruptor, I think, that's in this space, which is going to enable a lot of this to happen. And, we could probably run another webinar on digital identity, which, is a huge, I think, shift in paradigm for people around how secure their identity is. And somebody raised at the beginning of the call how that is very current and very concerning for people. So I think working hand in glove with all of people thinking about and working on digital identity right now would be a practical and sensible thing to do. And then lastly, just going back to your question about what else could we do, I think it would be great if the insurance industry, or those that want to participate in the open insurance industry, could go to government and say, these are the data sets we think should be shared for the insurance industry. Because at the moment, it's just this big black hole. Nobody has sat down and talked about which data sets might be included, might be excluded, might be useful. And so nobody, as far as I can tell, is actually doing anything to proactively go and say to government, right, here's a starting point. These are the data sets we think should be shared by the insurance industry. So let's fire the starting gun and get that ball rolling.
Yeah, that's a fantastic call to action, Anthony. I think that there's always a little bit of inertia in these things, and I think it's played out quite significantly and continues to play out in the context of CDR, where we're waiting for the government to kind of give that direction because it is a prescribed framework, rather than saying, well, hey, here's the straw, here's the straw man, here's the data sets, these are the use cases it relates to.
I think if we wait, they'll go and ask the ICA and they'll get an answer which suits the incumbents. If a few people got on the front foot and went and helped government think that through, you might get a different outcome.
Yeah, which is not going to be beneficial for consumers at all.
I think that's why these conversations are good. There's webinars, and then there's webinars where I think the outcome can actually be a group of us off this call, inviting any others to join us. Go, let's do that, AJ. Like, that's what we need to do. And let's have a conversation offline, because I completely agree that the opportunity is so clear. There is a great big gaping hole there, but actually, who is going to go and, someone needs to go and start speaking with different government stakeholders, and they're just educating them on the problem. And these things take time, and you've got to be clear on the problem, and we've got to kind of take away all of the technology and all of the complexity and just be really, really laser focused, and helping a bunch of people understand both the problem and the opportunity, I think. And we'd love to support that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
fantastic.
I think we're keen to be, the body for that conversation, and we've had some initial discussions, but it's how do you bring together stakeholders and do practical things, I think, rather than talking generality, the generality that you then get lost and kind of get caught, kind of get shot down. So I think it's providing those practical examples.
I guess this conversation talking about the incumbents, the parties that have been providing insurance for decades, if not much longer, to Australian consumers, shaping things in a way that is obviously beneficial for them, versus not so beneficial always for consumers, and a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs that are looking to drive forward a purpose because they believe what they're doing is actually helping people. Seeing it as a positive sum game, rather than that there's and that's an idealistic way of seeing it. And I think working towards ideals is very valuable. You don't always get there. There's always kind of someone that probably loses out in some way. What we've seen with banking is dragging their feet to stand up open banking here in Australia, and that same thing played out almost in every jurisdiction. But now seeing, oh wow, there actually is an opportunity here, particularly when they're both a data holder and a data recipient, because there's a whole bunch of things that they can now do. They've already done, they've got the technical, the security infrastructure in place to have a accredited data recipient status reasonably quickly. Insurers also have a big opportunity if we can see it in that positive sum way, where it's, if we do this well and we do it and keep the consumer and the ultimate beneficiaries that are meant to be there, being the consumer, the pie gets bigger for everyone. I think what you were talking about, this future of day trading, my policies and things like that, Anthony, I think is a very exciting area, like being able to just seamlessly switch or have my, my AI, the next version of Siri or whatever, ChatGPT 5, as scary as that might seem in some context, being able to kind of manage these things for me is quite exciting. It gives me my time back. It gives me my time back to focus on the things that matter to me in my life, which is not switching policies for insurers. So call to action, I guess, for anyone in the audience, coming together to actually figure this stuff out. Back to the life event approaches, one of the things that is interesting looking at these ecosystems and frameworks evolving globally is that, Saudi Arabia with open banking and open finance has taken that use case focused approach where the use cases are driving the evolution of their framework. And they've got a regulatory sandbox. They're trying to really create this innovation environment for participants within their ecosystem. What do we need to do to create that here in Australia and also in New Zealand, because CDR is kind of emerging as a reform over there as well, and there's a lot of cross-Tasman trade that can be facilitated as well.
Oh, I'll have a quick crack. I mean, I think there's opportunities to do that stuff now. I mean, there's some of the players who've built open banking platforms in the intermediary layer, so the AdaTrees and Follows of this world. I think would be, we certainly know we've worked with some of them who are thinking very broadly about sandboxes and use cases and setting up environments to enable that sort of stuff to happen, and would probably welcome, innovators and insurers coming and knocking their door and saying, why don't we try X, Y, Z? So I'm not sure there's much holding us back on that, to be honest. I think that could be done now.
And why isn't it? Maybe it's just that vacuum of opportunity that it just takes someone to kind of lead, and get the fast followers, and maybe a convening of a few different players, I guess, to really.
Well, I think in insurance, as I went back to my previous point, until there's certainty of which data sets are going to be available, it's quite risky for entrepreneurs to go and say, I'm going to build a business model on the following data sets being able to feed my business. If in 2 years' time, when they finally get around to making insurers become data holders, the data sets are not what people were expecting. So it goes back to that previous point. I think the sooner you can give people certainty as to the sorts of data sets that are going to be available in the insurance space, the sooner you'll see, the innovators and entrepreneurs in our community out there going, right, if I'm going to be able to get my hands on that data, this is the proposition I'm going to build.
Yeah, it's I think there's a willingness, at least from a lot of the conversations that I have with the governing bodies within CDR, to see this take place. So I think it feels like it's the word on the tip of the tongue, that people are yet to speak. Although we're speaking about it now, that the data standards body, I think if the insurance sector came together and said, look, here's the data sets, here's a early strawman candidate API, they would likely adopt it. Decision makers in Treasury as well, an ACCC, I think, are really willing to do it. I think there's maybe a siloing of collaboration, and territories to some degree that play on this. And I always think about this where, we're trying to create open standards and open up data, but we're not actually using open innovation to do it. Everything's still quite siloed in how everyone's learning and trying to innovate. It's kind of done in pockets and in departments and kind of closed within business and networks. So, I
think it's important as well not to underestimate that, let's go and define the data and people will adopt it. And I think we got to make a start, right? You're coming up with the first draft of hundreds. Someone's got to make a start. I wouldn't underestimate the complexity there though, because you go, where are we coming? If we're coming at it from a consumer data right perspective, and insurance is an information business, right? It's all about understanding risk. So there's information that is about the consumer, that the consumer's provided, but there's a ton of data actually there in the background that helps me underwrite that home insurance policy. Some of it I acquired from third parties, some of it I have my own proprietary data, some of it as is provided by the consumer. Drawing the line and working out like which problem are we actually solving for? Is it really about portability? Some of that data is secret source, some of that data is really unique to that underwriter. It would be really frighteningly easy, I think, to underestimate the complexity of that problem. And I think it is going back up a level and going, just being really clear on what we need to solve for to get the scope right, so that you have possibly any sort of chance of defining what that data looks like, and what someone is realistically going to be up for making available in some sort of CDR framework. So I think, AJ's point about it being, who's going to start speculatively building for an insurance CDR world without any certainty is a really good one. But I think just saying the same thing we're all saying, we've just got to make a start there at some point.
Yeah, we have a look at, my guess is that government's looking at this going, this is quite complex in the insurance space. It doesn't look like banking. It's very different. Data sets are very different. As you rightly say, there's all sorts of proprietary data sets which people will defend till they're, blue in the face about saying, sorry, we paid for and built this data set, we're not giving it away. So there's all those things to navigate here. And I suspect they've kind of given themselves a couple of years to think about it. But the fear is that you come back in 2 years' time, they won't have done much thinking about it. So they'll have done non-bank lending and they might have done telco, and then they would look at insurance and go, this is really hard. And we'll do superannuation next instead. That'll probably be what they do. So I think you're right, Jason. We shouldn't underestimate it. It is complex.
Yeah, but if we're dreaming up of this, working group that we're going to start and lead the charge, is it really about chunking it down to a first use case that is actually quite simple? Keep it contained. Something that is annoying and inefficient and doesn't work today, but actually once you understand the why and the data, it's not that complex. So find the easiest possible use case and try to go ahead with that. Dip the toe in and just look, we're not all going to drown. Of course, it is complex, and to get it to a full scale and a full rollout is going to take years. But I think it would be a real pity to just lose the appetite for it just because it is complex.
Yeah, think big and kind of build tiny as a principle is important. Definitely not underestimating the complexity and just the key differences between the insurance sector. We've got a mental model for how things work based on how it played out with banking. But insurance is just a very different, a different sector and proposition, and absolutely they are information businesses. The models that are used to understand how to actually provision the right policy are proprietary models. The regulatory, and compliance focus that drove the banking sector, Nick, that it's taken a while to kind of break out of those compliance mindsets as well for larger companies, and shift to how do we see this as an innovation opportunity? What are those tighter use cases that the industry can come together, Insurtech to bring and convene around providing that straw man to basically get the ball rolling rather than, like you said, AJ, wait, and then it becomes like too hard basket because that straw man hasn't necessarily been provided. What from your perspective, Nick, what are the countering things that need to be done to counter maybe some of the anxiety and inertia around moving this forward?
Good question, Matt. So from our perspective, we're a small bank. And so in theory, from our perspective, we had much more to gain than a large bank in sharing the information. All banks were mandated to share the information. The complexity that we face, even as a small bank in sharing information, was the way the information had to be gathered, stored, and structured to share it. Because the information we have, even as a legacy bank and even as a small bank, is that the data that's required is stored in multiple different systems in different ways. And so that's the big hurdle that the industry had to get over, hence why it costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Now that the platform is built, though, you've got to get over that. You've got to get over the fact that the industry needs to have some reason to want to build all this infrastructure to share the information. And the beginning part of it was being very clear what information to share. Then a whole bunch of players can build on top of that use cases on how to use it. But without that, it gets incredibly hard for someone outside of the players that hold the information to define requirements of people that hold the information to share it. Because literally the cost of sharing it is quite significant, and there needs to be some work up front to define what the information is and how it should be shared.
Yeah, it's a huge exercise in kind of data management and governance, particularly when you've got legacy infrastructure, like where all the data is, and being able to, interestingly, doing data mapping exercises many times for data protection impact assessments and things like that, mapping out where the data sits in a large complex organization is extraordinarily challenging, because there's data across so many different areas and systems. So it goes back to this point of not underestimating the complexity of a lot of this transformation that needs to take place to get these things moving. Fabrizia.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw something out there, and I don't know if it's going to be helpful or not, but we keep thinking that the transformation needs to come from the insurance industry, mandated or not mandated. But there is actually innovation, and this sounds a bit scary to say out loud, but there is innovation that can actually be driven by government bodies. So simple use case: you are applying for a car insurance quote. What are you asked? You're asked about your driving history and demerits. Now, to be honest, maybe I'm getting old, but I don't exactly remember if that little infringement I had was 6 years ago or 4 years ago. God knows. Certainly wasn't 2020. I was at home the entire year. But that data is there, and a government body has it. Now, I can go as a consumer, and I think it cost me, I looked at it a while back, maybe $22 to go and request to get that record. That's a use case. It's a use case that is possible, and is possible within what a government body can do. Now, again, I don't know if that's easier or more complex, but what I'm saying is there are plenty of use cases with plenty of parties and varying levels of complexity, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely one at that point in which you ask the question on that type of data. No one readily has that in working memory. They have to kind of go and find it, log into the government service, Service New South Wales or whatever, to kind of pull out that data. And it just kind of maybe comes back to that question, in consideration that you brought up, AJ, just that, the question of digital identity, being able to kind of prove I am who I say I am in the context of a transactional relationship between parties. We don't necessarily have that in place, and it's not necessarily seen as a critical component of the CDR framework itself. We've got TDIF that sits separately, Connect ID emerging as a private industry being involved in that. But we need digital identity to have these things work. Action initiation isn't necessarily going to work without it. So some important conversations that need to be continued to have and turned into some meaningful action over the coming months and years.
It's the chunking down of things, isn't it? Because I think the point you make, Fabrizia, is an excellent one. Like, you talk, how many car insurance policies are sold in Australia every month? Like, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands, and that's such a point of friction, and claims get declined because people maybe forgot, and then in a situation of not making the right representations, and there are these big friction points. It feels to me that there's this sort of progression. We start off with CDR, which is actually, as a consumer, I've got a right to my data, and these sort of principles and rolling it out across industries. But I think the dialogue in the UK is actually, it's beyond open bank. It's just open data, isn't it? It's this, actually the end state is the ability to be able to connect up all of the sources of information that we need in order to do the right thing by the customer and improve productivity and improve value in totality. And that's going to be the challenge, I think, for us in the insurance space, is trying to keep that scope. What is step one? Is it just the CDR principle of going, hang on, I just want access to my data from this place? And there's a separate activity to go, actually, government needs to open up more, and all these other stakeholders need to open up more so that we can get to that nirvana state. Working out which one of those is the most valuable battle for us to fight is interesting, because you could argue that, I think that's a really good point. Maybe we should just start off by making sure that government comes to the table, makes those sources of data more readily available.
I think that is, it's definitely something that has been part of the discussion for the past few years, and is definitely of interest to the government, to the policymakers within Treasury. It was brought up in the statutory review for CDR. It was responded to that government data sets are an important consideration as part of CDR. So looking forward to really narrowing in on how to chunk this down and figure out what are the right incentives. Maybe some, what are some final points from everyone here to make in light of the insights that we've just emerged from this discussion.
If I can just add something from the banking data's perspective, the banking data is available now, and I know that there are some pricing firms that interface with insurance businesses that are trying to get customer data about their transaction data on the promise that utilizing that into a price model, they'll be able to negotiate a better price. So they're not using insurance data, they're trying to get the customer to provide their transactional banking data to make some view of their risk and providing that risk to an insurance company to get a better price. That is a model where you don't need insurance data, you're an interface to an insurance company using banking data. I don't know what other models exist like that in insurance, but if that's a thought starter, maybe there are others.
Yeah, I think you're right, Nick. There is data, transactional data, that can be of value. It's about rethinking, where does that value sit? And in that example, the value goes back to the consumer. There's other applications of that. Maybe whilst I have the mic for the last bit, my other thought was, and I'm a marketer, so of course I'll say this, there is a chunking down of the issue and picking a small enough use case. Do we think there is also value in owning the narrative or presenting a narrative? So if you think about it, if you look at activating government or getting government support, that example, let's go back quickly to that example of the data about the driving history. The real outcome that we are trying to achieve, as Jason mentioned, is that we don't have any more claims declined because of that data point. So when you are a government and you're looking at experimenting and some of these things, what's the narrative? The narrative is, by opening up this data and making it more easy to use, we're actually solving a problem for the community. I don't know how we get that point across, but I think sometimes it's taking organizations and government on a journey with the narrative of what's the overarching benefit.
Great point, Fabrizia. The power of stories and those stories in driving the action that we need in this. Jason, Anthony, some final points and notes, further calls to action.
I couldn't agree more with Fabrizia. I just think the clarity there, I think, is what we need to focus on, and it's the consumer outcomes and just being super clear, because I think a lot of the a lot of the open banking things, your payments, consumers really connect with the friction-free kind of bank-to-bank payments. But some of the other kind of use cases, the take up is slower. And I think it's just about, we've just got to be really clear on what it means for the customer. So I'm just going to back that point.
Yeah, I would agree. I think consumer utility is absolutely critical here. We've got to find some use cases that make consumers wake up and go, this is a good thing, I want to get involved. And then I think we'll start to see, investment into this sector, and we'll start to see acceleration of open insurance. But I think, the practical next steps piece is a really good place to have taken the conversation today. And I think we should make sure we do some follow-ups on those practical next steps.
Excellent. Simone.
Yeah, no, I think we're at time. So I just wanted to really thank all of you. Thank you, Matt, for moderating the discussion. Thank you, Nick, Anthony, Fabrizia, and Jason. I mean, I think it was a really, sometimes these webinars, but I think this is a really interesting discussion, and I think certainly the first of many more conversations. So, so really thank you for your time, and let's follow up. I think the practical ideas about the data sets and the use cases and how we can help, and Insurtech Australia, and I'm sure FDATA and FinTech Australia are all keen to follow up this discussion and see how can we actually continue this rather than just wait for the next 2 years and wait for government to tell us what we should do. If you want to find out more about Insurtech Australia, we'll put the little plug up there. And yeah, let's keep talking. But thank you, everyone. Have a good evening or a good day wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.